Hi all, welcome to the Empowering Equine podcast, where we talk about all things related to science-based training and management, positive reinforcement, Lima focus training, and equine welfare and ethics. I'm your host, Alta van Niekerk. I'm joined by my husband as our moderator. Hope you enjoy this podcast and find inspiration to become the best horse person you can be for your horse. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you all have been doing super well. Husband, how's it been going?
It has been going quite good. And with you?
Oh, busy, but happy to get started with the podcast again.
Yes, we are a bit late on this one, but it's not a big problem. We know you're a patient group.
Yes, so you are very understanding.
Yes. Did you train any of your horses this weekend?
I did. I just did some bonding, not really much training. I got a new bitless bridle for Ali, so I fitted it to him and he looks so cute. He's the cutest little western pony. I love it.
Okay, so basically just therapy for your soul.
Yes, very peaceful, very quiet. Lovely.
Speaking of peaceful and quiet, what is today's theme?
Well, the topic for today, we have received a request to do a deep dive into learning theory based on the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning and how it looks in the real world and what the potential risks are associated with it, kind of like what we did in episode 2 with the use of punishment in the horse world. So before we get started, just a disclaimer, I am a positive reinforcement trainer and my aim is to practice it as much as I can. So if I sound biased, that is because I am.
And any good academic writer would disclose that.
Yes, thank you. But that being said, I'm not anti-pressure release. I believe in most cases it is unnecessary in my experience, but have I suggested to individuals who have reached out to me for help to rather stick to pressure release? Yes, I have, actually. The reason for that is much more complex than, me saying it'll just be easier or positive reinforcement can't fix that. Not at all. There were multiple factors at play, like limited resources, sometimes restraints, like I would rather be there in person if the person wants to address the challenge with positive reinforcement. The whole case was very complicated, and I believe that the best for both the handler and the horse was to exclusively use low-level pressure release. I've known this horse since it was born. I know and understand this horse's specific challenges and the behavioral challenges they face. And the handler has their own challenges and lack of resources. And that was not for a lack of trying or effort from the handler's part. I don't know any other person who puts the same amount of effort into their horses than this person does. So I had enough understanding and background to say that it was the best to put aside positive reinforcement for now, and they are actively working towards incorporating positive reinforcement back into their training so that they can be able to pick it back up later. And right now, they are doing fantastic. So, saying this does not discredit the power and ability of positive reinforcement. I firmly believe any and all problems can be fixed with positive reinforcement. If you have enough skill, if you have enough knowledge, and if you have enough experience.
And patience. Definitely patience.
And definitely patience, because it is a whole learning curve and it's relearning a lot of things. And I want to meet people where they are at right there. At the end of the day, I'm not working with horses. I'm working with people and their horses. Shame has no place in that relationship. As a people practitioner in my work life, Our first code of conduct is do no harm. In most cases, simply suggesting to people who genuinely want to help their horses and to be better for their horses, and just going off and saying, it's my way or the highway, either use positive reinforcement or sell your horse, because unfortunately, this is sometimes how it comes off to people. It's not our intent as people who want to share positive reinforcement, but that is how it's sometimes received. And that helps no one and does harm. So I would rather meet people where they are at and help without making people jump into positive reinforcement cold turkey. But I will advocate for the use of it as much as I can. Okay? Everybody happy? Everyone on the same page?
Yes, Mrs. Vanika.
Right, with all the housekeeping out of the way, let's get into how do horses actually learn. I think before we get into all the nitty-gritties, I want to share a study conducted by Warren Smith and McGreevy from 2008. The study aimed to assess the knowledge of learning theory among accredited, so in other words, high-level professionals, equestrian coaches in Australia. Surprisingly, 79.5% of the respondents considered positive reinforcement to be a quote-unquote very useful form of training. So that's great and everything, but only 2.8% of the 79.5% were able to correctly explain its use in horse training. So that's kind of a bummer. Furthermore, 19.3% of respondents considered negative reinforcement a quote-unquote very useful tool, but only 11.9% of the respondents were able to correctly define what negative reinforcement is. And punishment was rated to be quote-unquote very useful by 5.2% of respondents, but only 8 coaches, that would be 5.4%, was able to explain its application correctly. 78.2% of respondents explained that pressure and release was the most effective reward for horses. I explained in a post on my Instagram, and the post is titled "What Does Science Say?" that the release of pressure is not a reward. Horses do not find that rewarding. It's a relief. I won't be getting into much detail on the study, but in short, food is a valued reward for horses. This is from Keeson et al. 2020. And I want to quote something from that. I quote, "All horses demonstrate preference for treats/food rewards over human interaction, regardless of history." That's all I'm going to say on that. So what does this mean? These results show that the vast majority of equestrian coaches, trainers, professionals lack a correct understanding of what positive reinforcement is and what negative reinforcement is as they apply to horse training. All the way from beginner riders to upper level professionals are being taught the wrong application of learning theory. And to be honest, it shows. I was horrified to hear a popular equestrian YouTuber completely butcher what negative and positive reinforcement means. Like, I understand that people are free to interpret how it's applied any way they want, but one cannot argue with or bend and adjust the scientific definition of what the quadrants are and are not. There are universal definitions for a reason. It's important to gain a universal understanding of a definition of anything. So, learning theory describes how learners, animal or human, receives, process, and retain knowledge during learning. Cognitive, emotional, and environmental influences, as well as prior experience, all play a part in how understanding is acquired or changed and knowledge and skills retained. Whether we use natural horsemanship, clicker training, liberty work, whether we ride dressage, whether we ride jumping, whether we do Western, or even if we're just happy hackers. It is important to understand these basic concepts to, in turn, better understand our horses. Whether we are aware of it or not, our horses are always learning. They are constantly making associations between things they like and things they don't like. Horses are so good at picking up signals and predictors. We sometimes can't even tell what our horses are using to make sense of their environment.
That is interesting. Can you give us a few examples?
My favorite example is, we train a horse to load into a trailer, for example. The horse does it beautifully at home, not a problem. Then the weekend of the show rolls around, and then all of a sudden the horse just plants. He's stuck. And we can't understand why the horse all of a sudden doesn't want to load. We practiced this behavior all week, and the horse performed it, no fail.
I can attest to this. We had a horse that just wouldn't load on the weekend of the endurance ride that we're going on. The whole month, completely fine, no problems. The day of the ride, wouldn't load.
So we can assume the horse picked up the environmental cues that they are going to a show. Cues like maybe the truck is loaded up with supplies, the trailer is loaded with hay nets, or other supplies, and even our whole way of going about the loading process has changed, because this time we can't do this like 5 times for 2 hours. The horse, has to get up and go. We're a bit more tense now, and the horse has learned that in this context, this specific context, loading is a negative experience because the horse is now actually going to a show or an event and leaving the safety of his friends and going to a strange, new, scary place. So I've also seen instances where horses would suddenly become lame to avoid getting into a trailer or going out on a next leg of an endurance ride. This is actually a story our vet told us. And suddenly the horse has no lameness issues back at the paddock. This is of course not meant to say ignore your horse's signs of lameness or to say see horses are defiant or anything. It's to show how good horses are at picking up cues and predictors. And remember, all behavior serves a function whether we like the behavior or not.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Because you can imagine that if you couldn't talk to anybody else, and you're just observing everything, after a while you would see the patterns.
Yes. So, in behavioral psychology, reinforcement is a consequence applied that will strengthen an organism's future behavior whenever that behavior is preceded by a specific antecedent stimulus. Behaviors that are rewarded, i.e. reinforced with food, attention or play, are more likely to reoccur, and those that are ignored and corrected, which is a form of punishment, are less likely to recur in similar situations. This is known as operant conditioning.
What is operant conditioning?
Operant conditioning is sometimes referred to as instrumental conditioning. It's a method of learning that employs rewards and punishment for behavior. Through operant conditioning, an association is made between a behavior and a consequence. It can either be negative or positive for that behavior. There are 4 quadrants involved in learning. So we have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment. We've talked about this at great length in episode 2, right?
I'm not sure, but it's in one of the previous one. Listen to all of the previous 4 episodes and leave a comment below on which episode it was. Oh, I'm just kidding. LOL.
Engagement. Okay, so our 4 quadrants involved in learning is positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, which we talked about at length, and negative punishment. Each of these quadrants ends with a consequence that can make the behavior more or less likely to reoccur. It's important to remember here that positive means you're adding something. you're adding a consequence, and negative means you're removing a consequence. So when we talk about positive and negative, it's in the mathematical sense. It's not good, automatically good, or automatically bad.
Oh, okay, that makes it's so positive is a plus sign,
Yes.
not a good sign,
Yeah.
and negative is a minus sign, and not a negative sign, not a bad sign.
Yes, exactly. So let's start off with positive punishment, just getting a nice refresher.
A P plus.
P plus. Positive punishment is adding an aversive stimulus which will reduce the frequency of a behavior. This can be smacking, positive punisher, a horse for nipping or biting their handler to stop the biting behavior. We go into major detail on this in episode 2 of the podcast, so I won't be focusing on it too much in this episode. So we're going to straight on go to negative punishment.
B minus.
B minus. So negative punishment is the removal of a desired stimulus to reduce the frequency of behavior. So we're moving a horse off of grass, for example, which is the desired stimulus for the horse, onto gravel to make the horse stop moving.
Okay, so the punishment is the removal of the stimulus.
Yes. So
Okay.
we're negatively punishing the horse by moving him off of the grass because he's moving too much. A good human example can be a teenager stays out for an hour past her curfew, so her parents ground her for a week. The grounding is taking away something,
The social interaction.
the social interaction, for staying out past their curfew. More examples can be tying the horse to some people say it's a patience pole, some people say it's the tree of knowledge. Basically, the horse is left tied in isolation for extended periods.
Which makes no sense.
It is an example thereof, but it has elements of positive punishment attached to it. That's something also very important to keep in mind, is that we're not always looking at the quadrants as purely individual. You're always kind of teetering to some or other quadrant. There's no such thing as being purely positive reinforcement or purely negative reinforcement. You're always kind of like, there's always two sides to a coin, if I can put it like that, for lack of a better word.
I think where the confusion usually comes in is the word punishment, where punishment, in my brain, when I hear punishment, it's the adding of undesired effect. So a negative punishment is removing and it's the removing and adding, and now there's conflict where I get confused.
Yeah, it is hard, but I think something that really helps give it the correct idea is when we're working with positive reinforcement, I try to reward my horses as often as punishable as possible. My goal is to not, because when we're working with positive reinforcement, you're kind of teetering when you withhold for too long, or the horse performs the wrong behavior. Now you're not, and the horse thinks it performed a
desired behavior.
A desired behavior, but it wasn't technically a desired behavior, so you're withholding the food. That's negative punishment. You are the withholding of the food
Of something desirable.
Yes, is the punisher. You're punishing that behavior because you're not reinforcing it. You understand what I'm trying to say?
I'm getting there, but just jumping a bit ahead of myself now. So removing something desirable is negative punishment, and removing something undesirable is negative reinforcement.
Yes. So the removal
Is negative.
Because
And
that's
desirable is
the
punishment.
minus. You are subtracting that in a sense.
So removing something desirable is negative punishment. Adding something desirable is positive reinforcement.
Yes.
Okay. So when removing desired, it's negative punishment, and when you're removing an undesired reward or whatever, it's negative reinforcement. But when you're adding with positive, adding undesired is punishment, and adding desired is reinforcement.
Yes.
So it flips itself around whether you're adding or removing a
Yeah.
desired or an undesired item.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about, on which sides of everything you're tilting when you are using reinforcements, either negative or positive. But, spoiler alert, when positive reinforcement is done, you are kind of teetering on the edge of using negative punishment, because if you withhold for too long, the session becomes punishing. And I think the best example of negative punishment is when we don't feed/reward the horse when they perform any behavior, and that's not the behavior we want to see more of, we are negatively punishing it.
Okay, yeah, that seems simple enough, but is it really that simple?
No. No, unfortunately, it isn't. So we need to be careful when withholding food. When we are withholding food, this creates frustration, especially when we are unclear to our horses. Once again, the learner is the one who decides when something is negatively punishing. And if we do not have a good shaping plan in place, we might negatively punish the behavior we are actually wanting to see more of, because you can't see what the possible building blocks are towards the end results. So ideally, I want to give my horse as much opportunity to be right as possible. I don't want to rely on negative punishment in my training, because withholding food is frustrating to the horse. And my horses end sessions when they are frustrated, and I allow that. My horses have an out. So negative punishment has a very negative impact on the learning process and the motivation of the learner. Nothing is free. The use of punishment comes with a price, whether it be positive or negative. Another problem with negative punishment is that while it might reduce the unwanted behavior, it does not provide any other information or instruction on a more appropriate reaction or behavior. B.F. Skinner also noted that once the punishment is withdrawn, the behavior is very likely to return. So you're going to need to negatively punish more when you actively rely on it, as if that makes sense. While doing my research for this topic, negative and positive punishments fallout is often put into one camp. So one can take some of the fallout from positive punishment and apply it to negative punishment as well. So we would need to use our judgment. Like, negative punishment rarely results in something like injuries. But it does harm to the relationship between horse and handler and creates negative associations and avoidance. So let's jump into negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is removing an aversive stimulus to increase the frequency of behavior. So that can be releasing physical, so we are approaching a horse, or mental. With training, we later just give a slight body shift. So that's kind of like a mental pressure, for lack of a better word, from the horse's hind end, for example, when we want them to perform a hindquarter disengagement. A good human example is the chimes in our cars. when the car detects that we do not have our seatbelts on. The goal of the chime is to negatively reinforce us to put on our seatbelts. When we put on our seatbelts, the chiming stops. My dad actually hates that chime, and because he's in and out of his car / truck all day on the farm, he actually had the chime removed by someone who knows how to. So that was how far my dad was willing to go to avoid that negative reinforcement.
You just have to deal with the fallout. Wink, wink.
Yeah. So negative reinforcement is the most common form of associative learning used in horse training. Very likely the method we were taught when we began to ride. I know I was taught that, although we didn't use the word negative reinforcement or pressure release.
Guilty as charged as well.
Yes. I mean, because of that long history, it's our natural default mode, so to speak. One that we fall into with little to no thought at all. So negative reinforcement, how it works is, as soon as the horse responds in a way that fits our desires, like moving from a walk to a trot with our leg aids, we remove our leg pressure. It's a relief to a horse. Pressure release or negative reinforcement works with the horse's desire to avoid this discomfort or a perceived threat. Horses do not like or enjoy pressure and will more often than not work to avoid it. If we immediately release the pressure when the horse performs the desired behavior, the horse will connect his action with our response. The horse makes the connection that this pressing on my side stops when I go faster, for example. For pressure release to work effectively and ethically, the release of pressure must follow immediately after the desired response. But regrettably, some riders mistake pressure for punishment. I firmly believe, as someone who grew up and was taught this for many years, it's not because people deliberately use punishment because they would rather use punishment than pressure. It's because pressure is mistaken for the use of punishment. And this is something seen, unfortunately, very, very often. And so when the horse doesn't react to the initial pressure cue, then the trainer just escalates so quickly that it's very fear-inducing and very punishing to the horse. And just like positive reinforcement kind of works in conjunction with negative punishment, like we discussed earlier, negative reinforcement, you're kind of teetering on the edge of using positive punishment. So when we train with negative reinforcement, we need to be very careful not to actually punish our horses. So the pressure of negative reinforcement at its worst needs to be annoying or displacing, but it must never be painful or damaging. When that should be the goal, but often pressure needs to be increased to actually make the horse respond. The absence of the release of pressure at the wrong time, the use of opposing pressure simultaneously, and the absence of a good shaping plan are central to the development of acute and chronic stress responses in our horses, and can often lead to very dangerous behaviors when negative reinforcement / pressure release isn't used properly. So that basically means is that, once again, keep in mind the horse is the one that determines what is negatively reinforcing, and for some horses, not all, for some, us leaving them alone is actually negatively reinforcing. Us leaving them is reinforcing. And when a horse does not respond to the initial application of light pressure, we can either give a different pressure cue, which is, I would say, the ideal, or we would need to up the pressure. The escalation of pressure often results in horses reacting in a fear or act aggressively, and resulting in horses performing very dangerous behaviors. For example, let's look at the horse being trained to trailer load again. We want to train a horse to load into a trailer, and the horse finds the trailer aversive, scary, but he is being pressured, for lack of a better word, to go into the trailer. The trailer is something the horse wants to avoid. It's negative, it's scary, it's all these emotions, and the horse is displaying calming signals and displacement signals, and the trainer is missing all these signals of escalating stress and fear, and then the horse just goes over threshold and kicks out, rears, and just runs over the trainer in some cases, and that can lead to a very dangerous situation.
Okay, but if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, what if it works, and some circumstances the horse might get you hurt, so then negative reinforcement might not be that bad or harming?
That's a very good question, and something I also ask myself when I first started my positive reinforcement journey. Does pressure work? Yes, of course it does. People have been successfully training horses with pressure and release for years. I'm not dismissing its effectiveness, but that's the thing. Effectiveness is not enough, and it goes for positive reinforcement as well. I would like to quote Dr. Susan Friedman, who is an absolute pioneer in the field of animal training and behavior modification, and I linked the whole article in the show notes down below, so I highly recommend reading the entire article. The quote reads, "Effectiveness is not enough when it comes to choosing and applying behavior change interventions with animals. Borrowing from the field of applied behavior analysis with human learners, an expanded hierarchy of procedures is proposed that adds a second criterion to effectiveness, being relative intrusiveness. Without this ethical standard, interventions are likely to be selected on the basis of convenience, familiarity, speed, or blind authority, and may inadvertently produce the detrimental side effects of punishment and learned helplessness in our animals." Negative reinforcement teaches our horses to obey and respond, but it does not build much trust or attachment between horse and rider. It leads to a horse to seek and identify and use our human cues to determine what we want them to do. All very important abilities, and something I want to achieve with my positive reinforcement as well, but it does not offer the added benefit of teaching the horse that you're on his side, so to speak. These dangerous behaviors, like you ask, can either be avoided or addressed with positive reinforcement in a regular training session. You know, I once heard a trainer make the statement about a very reactive horse. The horse was an absolute wreck. The poor thing, and the trainer explained that, "See, this is why you can't use positive reinforcement." And I wish I could say, the horse doesn't act this way as a baseline. The horse is reacting this way because the horse was fearful of the pressure that was being applied. The horse was in fight or flight. The training that was being used is the reason the horse acted this way. Because for some, that is the goal of pressure release. Making the wrong thing hard or scary and the right thing easy or relieving. Ideally, we want to avoid sending our horses over threshold. Once the horse is over threshold, this is when things get dangerous. And of course things happen. Then I would switch over into management mode, address the situation the best I can with the tools I have available to me at the time to make the situation safe for me and the horse and other people around us. But negative reinforcement is the most common form of associative horse training, but it requires superb coordination, it requires good timing and equitation. It teaches a horse to respond like a good little soldier, but it rarely motivates the horse to, seek out more or engage more or, look forward to seeing you and building that trust bank account with the handler.
Okay, I understand. But then how would you explain natural horsemanship exercises? Like join up, and where is the goal to form a connection to the horse? Is this an outdated form of training, or can you explain a bit on that?
I would say that it is largely due to misinformation and the misinterpretation of horse body language. Most of our commonly understood and widely accepted interpretations of equine body language has been built upon the belief of dominance theory, which has been debunked over and over, as well as the misinterpretation of language signs and calming signals that the horses give to us. A study conducted by Miller et al. 2016 found that the philosophy of certain, let's call them horsemanship gurus, just to keep it all neutral, is an, and I quote, overinterpretation of the horse's behavior in the round pen, and a product of wishful thinking, which is not justified through behavioral research, end quote. Another study identified that behavioral signs of equine distress are poorly recognized. They therefore warrant an increased prominence in order to reduce equine suffering. This is from Bell et al. 2019. More research papers have explained that the use of anthropomorphic language may lead people astray, causing false beliefs that result in an unrealistic aspiration and misinterpretation of equine behavior. It may also give people reason to use aversive or harmful techniques such as positive punishment. For example, horses, quote-unquote, submitting to us as the leader is more likely a result of reinforcement/force rather than a result of the human attaining a high social status and a leadership role. Without naming any names, I'm sure we can think of any popular mainstream pressure release trainer and hear the use of anthropomorphic labels like defiant, disrespectful, dominant, marish, and some of you might think, well, it's just a word, what does it matter? And my answer to that is, words do matter. I had a trainer tell me about my own horse was that my horse was a bully, and he used that word. He said as much. He said he's a bully. And as a child who was bullied growing up, I immediately went on the defense. And this was all subconscious. When we label horses something that they simply are not, we enter into an interaction with that animal with a preconceived notion of that animal. And I found in my experience, it's just from a place of being uneducated. It's not because the person is a bad person. But I think it's important to highlight. If you want to learn more about horse communication, I highly recommend reading Language Signs and Calming Signals of Horses and Horses in Company. And I tagged all my links I mentioned prior in the show notes as well.
Okay, so why don't more people use positive reinforcement over negative reinforcement? If it's the better option then?
Well, I can only speak for myself as someone who has gone the negative reinforcement pressure release route and now choose positive reinforcement. So why don't I opt for using it in my personal training? Simply because what my goals are and the way I want to train my horses best aligns with using positive reinforcement. I use the humane hierarchy, which opts for the use of positive reinforcement before resulting to negative reinforcement. And the better you get at implementing positive reinforcement, the less you need to resort to using alternative methods. There has not been a training session where I had to resort to negative reinforcement because I prepare myself. My antecedent arrangements and my shaping plan is so that it is not necessary. But I think what puts people off of using positive reinforcement is the lack of control people feel they might have. We have been taught that the only way we can gain control of our horses is to use pressure, fear, or the perceived threat of fear and pressure. Now, we are trying to say that, you can get all that and then some with positive reinforcement too. It seems crazy, it seems ridiculous. I felt this way as well. I remember thinking, that's cute, but that's not real training. You need to be in charge and you need to be in charge of the situation, because if you don't, they will walk all over you. I didn't just wake up one morning and decide to do this for shits and giggles. I was open to hearing what other people who have found great success in it had to say about positive reinforcement, and I heard them out before completely dismissing it. And once again, this is not to dismiss negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement has made a huge impact on equine welfare from the practices that were used before. The horsemanship gurus we have all seen has made a huge impact on the treatment of horses. It was a huge step in the right direction, but we know more now. We are still learning so much, and I'm happy to say that there are more and more research coming out that looks into equine welfare, and we can improve for the benefit of the horse.
So let's say, hypothetically, you had to only train with negative reinforcement. How would you go about that? How would you do it?
So hypothetically, ideally I would use non-escalating pressure release if I had to only use negative reinforcement, but it is very hard and can be a very slow learning process, but definitely possible. I like how Warwick Schiller approaches his training. I love how he words his training and what and why he's doing what he is doing. He doesn't label his horses as spiteful or defiant or disrespectful or base his training off of outdated concepts like dominance theory. Another local trainer I really enjoy watching on Facebook is Mike from MDV Equestrian here in South Africa. He rebacks horses bridleless. And I mean, that is so amazing. I can't deny that, and I really appreciate everything he advocates for. As well as Gareth from Heartfelt Horsemanship. Okay, so with all that being said and everything, let's get into my wheelhouse. Let's talk about positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is adding a desirable stimulus to increase the frequency of behavior. So rewarding a horse with food, which is the positive reinforcer, for standing still while mounting to encourage the behavior of standing still at the mounting block. A good human example is a teacher that gives a student extra credit for turning in their homework on time, for example.
Is that why you give me a cookie every time I help you in the kitchen?
Yes, I do.
What's this that you do?
Yes, this is my non-mechanical clicker bridge signal.
And yes, she really does try to positive reinforce me.
Yes.
A lot. But I don't mind. I get a cookie out of it. I hear you talk a lot about science-based. What has science said about positive reinforcement?
I would like to start off by saying that positive reinforcement has been successful in all species of animals, from whales to tigers, elephants, crocodiles, apes, mice, from the most dangerous predators to the most timid prey. Positive reinforcement has been shown to work exceptionally well in shaping desired behaviors, while keeping the trainers safe. It has been shown to improve the welfare of laboratory animals and induce positive emotions in numerous animal species. Several authors have found that horses, specifically trained or rehabilitated using positive reinforcement, which strengthens a behavioral response. Horses tend to learn faster, show greater motivations to engage in training, and display more explorative behaviors, affiliative behaviors, and less problematic defensive behaviors during training, like biting or kicking. And horses trained with positive reinforcement have better memory, so they retain the information much better. Positive reinforcement trained horses tend to develop a more positive attitude towards their trainer, and that goes beyond the training session and that individual trainer, and remains over a long period of time. That is the key difference for me personally between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. That building of positive associations. Now I hear people say, I don't want my horse to do it for the food. I want the horse to do it for me. And to that I say, behavior is always being reinforced by something. I did a whole episode on that in episode 3 of the podcast. As per tradition, I would like to quote Adele Shaw. And I quote, "Because of the open communication, the autonomy and the form of motivation changing, positive reinforcement can help you develop a stronger relationship with your horse. When your horse learns that you will no longer force them to quote-unquote obey through pain, pressure and punishment, but instead you'll create an environment where it's fun and exciting to learn, they will look forward to being around you and working with and for you." I linked that whole blog post as well. I recommend reading it. But we need to keep things fair. So what are the drawbacks of using positive reinforcement? Well, first I would like to say off the bat that many drawbacks are often misconceptions. I'm not going to be focusing on things like, oh, positive reinforcement makes horses bite, because it doesn't. Poor training does, and things like that. So I'm going to be focusing on real drawbacks, quote unquote real drawbacks. First and foremost, positive reinforcement is not a fix-all. Incorporating harsh negative reinforcement and positive punishment often masks and overrides the real causes for pain, poor welfare, and other causes of the unwanted behavior. Positive reinforcement can't make the symptoms of pain or poor welfare disappear. In some cases, it actually makes it, in air quotes, worse. For me personally, it's not a negative actually, because now I know what's wrong with my horse. You can't train away pain. You need to address it. Another thing I see a lot is that it isn't foolproof. Positive reinforcement still requires skill and knowledge, and mistakes can be made. The incorrect application can result in many unwanted behaviors and even dangerous behaviors, just like with negative reinforcement. This is why I always hammer on get help, get guidance. I'm always more than happy to help, and I'm very active on my Instagram, so if you ever have any questions or you run into some issues, I'm more than happy to help out where I can. Although it does create a positive association, it's not guaranteed to make our horses happy. What I mean by happy is that it won't justify or counteract an inappropriate lifestyle. It can't undo, so to speak, a horse kept in isolation, for example. A horse trained with positive reinforcement doesn't automatically mean the horse is happy or we have a moral high ground. I can do a whole episode on this actually, but in short, training can't undo pain, poor lifestyle, and so on. There are more common misconceptions about positive reinforcement training, all in my opinion at least, a lot of straw man arguments. If you go and Google disadvantages of using positive reinforcement horse training, you will find a lot of highly opinionated pieces and ironically people who have never used it themselves. And that is not to dismiss their concerns or anything. I understand that positive reinforcement is still widely misunderstood and people are speaking out of a place of not knowing. One of the articles you will find on Google is a discussion between a few horsemanship trainers. All of them, some more politely than others, just rip apart and completely dismiss the use of clicker training. And they use the word clicker training rather than positive reinforcement. Not a single one of those trainers has experience using positive reinforcement. Not one of them. I'm not saying don't hear what they have to say. What I'm saying is that is super biased and comes from a place of misinformation. And I mean, I'm biased as well, but not out of a place where I have no idea what negative reinforcement means or how it can be applied in a way that causes the least amount of damage or fallout. So another misconception I just want to mention is that positive reinforcement is applicable to only a few or for certain tasks. Again, this comes from a place where positive reinforcement is so new we can't imagine training certain behaviors any other way than with pressure. You can literally train anything with positive reinforcement. It just looks differently from what we are so used to seeing on a regular basis and what we see other people doing. But I mean, the biggest drawback, real drawback to using positive reinforcement for me personally is that it can feel lonely sometimes. Some days I feel like I can't share what or why I do with other people for fear of judgment or people thinking I'm judging them. I'm not ashamed of what I do, not at all. I have a whole podcast and social media platform dedicated to it. Not at all, but I think for some people, when I share with people in my personal life, like I would say, I really enjoy training with positive reinforcement and I'm greeted with judgment and defensiveness. And this has happened to the point where I was like, I don't want to be an outcast anymore. I mean, why can't I just be normal? And I understand why people might feel people who use positive reinforcement can be a bit judgmental. And it kind of made me feel like, isolated from the rest of the equestrian world for a time until I really started to connect with people who use positive reinforcement and started connecting with and getting inspiration from these amazing horse people. So finding a supportive community is so important. For me personally, I found the most supportive and least judgmental platform to be Instagram. Facebook can be a bit of a mixed bag. And I've also found a fantastic community in the Willing Equine Academy, where we have a whole group where we just talk about positive reinforcement all day and post positive reinforcement things. And we have meetings, and that makes it a little bit less lonely. So I guess, in short, no quadrant is pure or without its own set of drawbacks and challenges. Each requires skill and knowledge. Never stop learning, never stop trying to be better. We're all just trying honestly and trying to navigate this whole thing. Hear everyone out, even if you do not wish to train the way they train. We can all respect one another without needing to belittle each other or each other's methods. It's fine to have concerns and point them out, please do, but do so out of a place of wanting to learn more and be better. So that's all we have for you today. The husband, thank you for sitting through this.
No problem. It was quite informative. I really learned the differences between the 4 quadrants.
That's fantastic, and that's the goal of this podcast. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our listeners and for all of the support. If you don't mind, wherever you're listening to the podcast, if you mind leaving us a little review, a few stars if you would like. If you have any suggestions we can do about the podcast or have any questions, we can do a whole Q&A episode if you would like. So just shoot me a DM and we can answer a bit of your questions maybe in a future episode.
Yeah, and share it with a friend. Yeah, we can increase the community.
Yeah, so with that being said, be kind to one another.
Hug your horses.
Oh wait, that's the wrong way around.
Yes.
Okay, so
be kind to one another.
No, still wrong. Hug your horses.
Be kind to one another.
And no, you have to say it like hug your horses and be kind to one another.
Okay, let's start again. 1, 2, 3.
Hug your horses.
Hug your horses.
And be kind to one another.
And be kind to one another.